insightful speakers that we have a very nice lineup of speakers for today's discussion, which comes just nearly a month before the 15th meeting of the Conference of Parties, the COP15 of the UN Convention on Biodiversity that will be happening from early December in Montreal, Canada. And I understand that young people from all over the world are eager to know what this COP has in store for them, what the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework has in store, not just for young people, but for other vulnerable and marginalized groups as well, and whether the coming post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework will deliver on its ambitious backdrop, and it will also be a transformative shift from the IT targets that we had from 2011 to 2020. And so in preparation for that, the Global Youth Biodiversity Network Africa chapter has been holding a series of intergenerational dialogues where we engage our senior citizens, experts, and people from various sectors, and of course, young people to understand various perspectives on conservation. This is not just to create a safe space for dialogue, but also to get a deeper understanding on what the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework means for all these groups, and how we can then create cohesion and collaborative frameworks that will help us to stop doing things the same way that we have been doing since the first conference of the parties of the CBD, and hopefully transition into actionable, on-ground, people-centered, and stakeholder-backed frameworks that work for all, and most importantly, sustain the very resource to which we depend, which is our Mother Earth and nature as a whole. And so today we're having a very, very great speaker, a friend of Jibin, and the director of CoalitionWILD, Yen Parico, who will be our first speaker of the day. We are so lucky to have Yen with us, and we can't wait to hear from her and what she has to tell us. And so before I welcome Yen, and before I welcome Irene, who is the moderator of that session, I just want to remind everyone of some nice ground, or in this case, Zoom rules that we have all come to be familiar with in the last 2 years. So, of course, the first one is please stay muted if you're not talking, and use the buttons that are at your disposal if you want to talk. So you can raise your hand, you can put it in the chat, or you can send us, the co-hosts, a direct message with whatever concern that you might have. Another one is, please, this is a safe space. You're going to hear diverse views. We are going to talk about, topics that are not, agreeable, if I can say that, by everybody in terms of opinions. And so please respect everybody's take, especially when we are talking about, the 30 by 30 or area-based conservation measures that can work for Africa and can work for young people across the world. The very essence of these dialogues is that those diverse opinions are aired. So please kindly respect everyone's opinions. And if you have to disagree, please do so in a very amicable way. Another one is we're going to have translators. So we have people who will be kindly helping us to translate from English to French and French to English, respectively. These are volunteers from gybnafrica. Most of them are coordinators of the Anglophone chapters of Gybin here in Africa, and they have volunteered to, make this session understandable to all, and that we can't really thank them enough. So please just know that they are translators, there will be translators, and these sessions are going to be translated. And lastly, please have fun while at it. This is a youth space. Even though we are having experts who are coming to talk to us about various topics, just have fun. Feel free to raise your concerns and opinions. Ask as many questions as you can. Let us utilize the speakers as much as we can to learn from them, to share, and also to gain something by the end of this session. So Irene, if you can hear me, please take over, and thank you so much everyone for joining once again.
Thank you so much, Kelvin. Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. My name is Irene Atunda Kananura from GYBN Uganda, and I'm really feeling great to be your facilitator for this session, and I welcome everyone. Given my role, I'm going to give you a little brief about this session. It will really consider what is effective, efficient, and diverse and equity-driven tools, strategies, partnerships, and approaches that are available or need to be refined and developed to reach the 30 by 30 target in Africa. And we shall have Yen Parico, our dearest speaker for this session, but in a very few minutes, please allow me to introduce to you Yen by reading his profile. So Yen Parico is a firm believer in the significant influence of the youth in creating a better future for the planet. Yen Parico is advancing youth empowerment as the director of CoalitionWILD, a for youth by youth global organization creating lasting youth leadership for the planet through capacity development training, mentorship, and storytelling. Prior to joining CoalitionWILD, she was a consultant at the International Rice Research Institute, where she assisted in increasing the capacity of farmers to use ICTs and small island developing states research and communications intern at the United Nations Development Program, UNDP. And her experiences and learnings in the Philippines shaped Yen's deep-rooted foundation as a sustainable development advocate. Her career focus on passion have been to support small communities and underrepresented people in creating solutions to the challenges that are faced in the everyday lives. And Yen is driven to find ways for those groups who are often hardest hit by the effects of the climate crisis and biodiversity loss, and to create change where and when it is needed most. She devotes most of her time to researching how youth can contribute to protecting half of the planet while empowering local communities. And finally, Yen holds a master's degree in sustainable development from Catholic University, Leuven. That is Yen Parico, and we are really grateful to have you on this session. Over to you, Yen, for your presentation. Thank you so much. Yen, are you there?
Yeah, sorry, I just had like a bit of problem unmuting myself, but I'm here. Yeah, well, first of all, I want to thank Gybn Africa and Gybn CBD for inviting me in this intergenerational dialogue. This is actually my first time to join an intergenerational dialogue, like leading a session like this. So I'm really, really grateful for giving me your time and for allowing me to have this space to discuss this. So as they mentioned, I will be discussing the area-based conservation as a tool for delivering Target 3 of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. But I want to make sure, or I want to clarify that this should be efficient, effective, diverse, and equity-driven tools with the strategies as well. Yeah, so first question is, what would be like the ideal world, I think it would be like the simplest answer is increasing and securing land tenure of indigenous peoples and local communities. Because according to Tenure Facility, this is a facility that provides grants to secure the rights of indigenous peoples and local communities to their lands and forests. So they're based in Stockholm. And based on their research, their indigenous peoples and local communities live and manage more than half of the world's land, but they only have legal ownership of only 10% of the ancestral territories. So if you imagine that they get all the legal ownership for this, we would have been able to be conserving half of the planet just by the indigenous peoples. But of course, this is not an ideal world. We're not in this world. So we have to take, I guess, like a rougher path to this, but that doesn't mean that we can't achieve our goals. I'm going to be very transparent. As I mentioned, I am devoting my time right now to promote conserving half of the planet. And this is not coming from out of the blue or like not just a random research. This is actually supported by the recent IPCC report. It says, and I quote, "Some countries have agreed to conserve 30% of the Earth's land," and this is what we call the 30 by 30. But conserving half may be necessary to restore the ability of natural ecosystems to cope with the damage wreaked on them. So this is also supported by the IUCN. And this is why at the World Conservation Congress in 2018 in Marseille, the Motion 101 passed with a broad consensus, with scientists in almost every country calling for a long-term target of 50%. This means that we're not going to disregard the 30%. We just want it to be a milestone. But in the longer term, 50% is recommended. But of course, there's a setback, and this is of course justified. There are a lot of human rights violations that were reported in the past years. And I get that this is one of the critics of the 30 by 30 and also half. But many indigenous groups actually are lobbying for a larger 50% global target. So for example, in the Amazonia region, they're calling for 80% conservation target in their area. And this is called Motion 129 that also passed in IUCN during the World Conservation Congress. So I'm not going to fully go on depth for the 50% because we're here for the 30 by 30. But I just want to first say that that's where I'm coming from. And I'm supporting 30%, 30 by 30. And I'm against the government using this agenda to commit land grab and human rights violations and displacement. So what I'm here to say is that we have to be mindful of how it is going to be implemented, because looking at the news and looking at how we are moving forward at COP15, it seems like this is going to be implemented, the 30 by 30, but it's up to us, or it's going to be our responsibility as citizens to make sure that this is going to be implemented properly by the governments. We are going to be overseeing this ourselves. We should be. Yeah, so today I will be focusing on how we are going to achieve the equitable outcome of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. But the first thing that I would like to mention, that's why I said we have to be very mindful, is that we're already at 34% of the world's land under protected governance. You see, if we include the vast stretches of biologically diverse land governed by indigenous peoples and local communities, and then added this to the 17%, there's already the 17% of the global land that's already protected or conserved by the governments, including OECMs, we have a total of approximately 34% of the world's land area under protective governance. So this is a report by Territories of Life back in 2021. This means that if we're not careful, that we secure the lands of the indigenous peoples, we're going to spend the next 8-10 years just basically doing an inventory and saying, okay, we reached 30%, but we already reached it right now. So here are my conditions. Not my conditions, but should be the conditions of the 30 by 30. And the first one would be the exclusion of any indigenous territories in the implementation. So this means only lands and waters where tenure or ownership is not contested or claims by indigenous peoples should be designated as protected areas under the 30 by 30 programs. So this means, going to the next line, is that the creation of mainstream protected areas or OECMs outside of traditional lands should be implemented. We should make sure that the governments are not going to use this agenda just to land grab any of the indigenous lands and say that we're protecting these areas. And then the third one, and I mentioned this earlier, is the expansion of indigenous land tenures should be secured or should be adopted in the 30 by 30 implementation. And then lastly, we have to be very strategic in terms of implementing the 30 by 30. I mean, on top of all the conditions about indigenous territories, we also need to be scientifically based, like we were basing our strategy based on scientific research. So before I move forward with the strategic implementation, I just wanted to first discuss what are OECMs. So in de facto, this is like the effective long-term conservation that is taking place outside the currently designated protected areas under a range of governance and management regimes implemented by a diverse set of actors. So diverse set of actors, this could be like indigenous peoples, local communities, this could be co-management, the private sector, or the government agencies. So OECMs, it says that can contribute to ecologically representative and well-connected conservation systems. So this has this comes in in many ways. So it could be managed by small-scale fisheries or by low-impact agroforestry. This is actually said specifically by the Emily Darling from the Nature Commentary of Wildlife Conservation Society. So this means this could bring a lot more people to the conservation table. And moving forward to the strategic implementation that I was talking about earlier, back in 2017, there was this paper, it's called an ecoregion-based approach to protecting half the terrestrial realm. And I will also link it later on. In this paper, they surveyed around 846 terrestrial ecoregions. And based on this, they were able to identify or categorize which ecoregions are actually effective or have by far the best biodiversity outcomes and the least reduction in species populations. Now, if you can see this map, I'm not sure if it's so clear. Is it clear, Irene? The map? It's okay. Okay. So as you can see, the green one, it's called half protected. This means that in these areas, half is protected. Half of the area is protected. And then second, we have light green, these ones, for example. And these light green areas it means it's still ecologically intact. So that means it's still important conservation objective for protection. So this means nature could still reach half in these areas. So that means less than 50% of the total ecoregion area is protected, but the sum of the total ecoregion in these areas, the total ecoregion protected and unprotected natural remaining 50% or more. And then the yellow part here, as you can see, this means that nature could still recover. Now, this is where we come in. The sum of the amount of natural habitats remaining in these ecoregions are protected in less than 50%, but still more than 20%. So this means we still have a chance to restore and rewild these areas. And this is what we were talking about, the OECMs as well. So what we mean here is not only biological restoration, but also cultural restoration. So this means we need to break down the culture and nature divide. So an example for this would be community-led conservation, restoring traditional livelihoods in these areas, or finding alternative livelihoods to make sure that we are not pushing the boundaries and making ecosystem collapse. And the red ones, when we see the red ones, it seems like, oh, it's like an alarm coming out. It's like, that's like the natural state for ours, like to see a red color. But this only means that while the area would be categorized as destroyed, this also means that we, as in the communities here, could just lower the impact in these areas. That doesn't mean there's no hope. It only means that we need to lessen the consumption there. We need to make sure that it's not going to like pushing to the boundaries or like the brink of its boundaries. Yeah, so after all those talks about the scientific or like the strategic implementation, I also want to go back to the recognition of Indigenous rights. And this is where we come in as part of the youth, and also partnering with Indigenous peoples, or even creating an Indigenous Council, for example. We need to go back to the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Under Articles 26, 27, 28, the right to recognition to lands and restitution should be recognized by the governments. So the next one would be the right to redress, which is Article 28, for the past and current wrongs. And the last one is to the right to development, Articles 23 and 32. So the fact is that we need to use the next 10 years to expand IPLC land tenure, while also restoring areas that are not claimed by the IPLCs to increase the protected areas. That is the main goal. If we did both these things and then double the area of OECM stewarded by the IPs to 20 to 30% the terrestrial surface, and increase protected areas by 10% through restoration and rewilding efforts, that's basically like utopia. That is what we are trying to achieve and have. But that's just like the recommendation that we're coming from. My final note from this slide is that Indigenous peoples have rights, whether they're recognized or not. But it's up to the states, and they have the obligations in respect of those rights. And that's something that we need to always consider. And in the new global biodiversity framework, and this is from the commentary by Carl Burkhardt, and I'm also going to link the article later on. He says that all Indigenous and community lands that provide natural habitat for species could and should be incorporated into government targets. But we need to make sure that those communities are given proper land tenure and territorial finance for their conservation efforts. And lastly, for like other recommendations, and this is also what we're trying to do at Wild Foundation and Coalition Wild. So we want to establish councils where Indigenous peoples are leading these councils. So this means they could oversee the implementation of the GBF, and they could oversee how the governments are implementing anything that's related to land tenure or anything about protected areas. And as part of the youth as well, we could also create all these councils to make sure that they are accountable to their own actions. We can create youth councils to work with the communities and disseminate Indigenous knowledge. We could create youth councils to assist Indigenous councils in overseeing the implementation of global biodiversity framework. I know it seems like, oh yeah, the Indigenous peoples have done so much for the world, and I feel like we're asking so much from them, but I feel like we just have to learn from them. And that's also one of the things that we need to establish at the global biodiversity framework. We need to go back to our roots and understand what's our relationship with nature and how it should be like. And I know that the Indigenous peoples are very willing to help us learn these things. So I also listed down all of the articles that I mentioned earlier. So yeah, there you go. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Yen. That was really so amazing and educative. And indeed, the indigenous people are now known as the best and so far the most effective conservationists. And we need to respect their rights. They have rights and to the land that they protect, and we should be considerate of those rights in whatever sort of implementation we are going to do. And we shall entertain questions from the audience, from the participants, in case you have any questions. I'll take like 2 questions because of time, and maybe the rest could come up through the chat. So any 2 people who are ready with questions for Yen Parico, please raise your hands.
I think Solomon says that he has a question. Is that correct?
Okay.
Yeah.
Solomon, you can come in.
Okay, thank you for the opportunity, and really I'm happy to be here, and thank you, Miss Yen, for your presentation. The things you are addressed. My question is, I have 2 things. Right now in Ethiopia, I'm from Ethiopia. We have about 5 biodiversity reservations are established currently, and 1 is on process for establishment and to become certified with UNESCO and worldwide known biodiversity reserve. But you addressed in your presentation to establish biodiversity reservation. There are things we should have addressed, especially related to with the community and the indigenous people who live around that resource. What a problem right now we are facing is there is many lands free which are not under the control of any person, and which is land which is anybody not owned or not owned by organization or people's nearby. But when we are going to establish and demark that land for biodiversity reservation, project and establish the reservation. But the problem comes after establishing the resource, because of there is no benefit sharing, sustainable benefit sharing ways of to meet the interest of the people, indigenous people who live around the forest and the biodiversity is the current problem. As I told you, we have 5 biodiversity reservations in Ethiopia. Those reservations are currently facing by invasion from the people around the forest and the biodiversity reserve area, because of the people ask us, they need something from, they expect from the project, and also to preserve the forests and the diversity of those area, they need compensation and then the proper, what we call it, benefit.
You wind up, Solomon?
Interest of benefit.
We don't have so much time. Would you wind up, please? Yeah, thank you so much. And Yen, I request you allow me read these questions so that you could respond to them all at once if possible. We also have Knowledge Vinci in the chat, and he's saying the issue of tenure is geographically difficult to implement. How do you, Yen, propose it happens in Africa, for example, where land is already being taken from, where land is already being taken from colonial past? And another one says, how is the 30 by 30 going to protect the rights of indigenous communities with regards to issues of multilateralism, realization of conservation and use of violence? Are we not risking further abuse of local communities? So please, Yen, kindly, would you respond to these questions? So in case of limited time, you could also add the rest of the explanations to the chat. Over to you, Yen, please.
Thanks so much, Irene. I will answer first the PWAS because that's really within my wheelhouse, or that's my wheelhouse. I would say that's how it's a 30 by 30 going to protect the rights of indigenous communities. That's why in the first part of my presentation, I explicitly mentioned that in the 30 by 30 narrative, we are not going to include the indigenous lands in this agenda. So what does that mean? This is actually supported as well by the International Indian Treaty Council. In like recently, I think it was in March that they had this conference in Guatemala. They specifically mentioned that they really oppose the inclusion of any indigenous lands or territories as defined in Article 26 of the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples in the 30 by 30 policy. So what we mean here is that we are going to establish new protected areas outside of the indigenous lands. So that means all these indigenous lands with the title are going to remain untouched. Now, the next step would be making sure that we are increasing the tenure of these indigenous peoples. And that is actually a possibility as well for the 30 by 30. Of course, even now we are risking further abuse of local communities. If we are not even establishing the 30 by 30, there will be even more human rights violations. And also in some of the areas that do not even have tenure or like that's not secured by indigenous peoples, they're also risking it that even within the boundaries or like near the boundaries of the indigenous people's lands, there might even be state-owned or state recommended mining or gas exploration, etc. So that is something that we're trying to achieve, or what we're trying to prevent, is that the indigenous lands are included in the 30 by 30 policy. And also because it's not going to be worth it, because like I mentioned earlier, if we include the indigenous people's lands, we're already at 34%. So in theory, we're not even going for 30 by 30 because we're already at 34%. So this means we need to make sure that the governments are not going to include the indigenous lands. That's it.
Thank you so much. Is there any other question running in the chat? We could just
yeah.
Okay, that we are entering the time for the next session, and thank you so much, Yen. We are really so glad that you shared with us such amazing and educative information, and we're looking forward to more of these engagements and sharing knowledge. So allow me introduce the next session panelist, who is going to be Kevin, to also host our next speakers of the coming session. So Kevin, are you there?
Yeah, thank you so much, Irene. Before we let Yen go, I think it's only fundamental that she speaks to the, draft position that the CBD already has right now, and whether I know most of us are asking ourselves, because she mentioned something to do with, the 30% being already exceeded in some fronts. And so should this implementation be in accordance to like a national circumstances, or should we have like a blanket target that every country works towards? And also, as you answer that, Yen, please give your final remarks before I transition to the next session. And thank you so much, Irene, for being such a wonderful moderator.
You're welcome, Kevin. Thank you.
Okay, yeah, I'll try to be quick with this, and I already answered, and I linked like an article over there. This means that the 30 by 30 is actually not a one size fits all. This means that some areas are not even going to reach 30%. And then some areas or some countries will have to increase their targets. So these areas would be Brazil, which is actually good because the Amazonian tribe are asking for 80% of their lands protected. But that doesn't mean that we are just going to focus on protected areas. What we also need to focus on is restoration. And like what I mentioned, this is where we should come in and actually focus on community-led conservation. This is like probably something or like a scenario for those areas that are already, I would say, in the map that I showed you earlier, that's not per se destroyed, but also in peril. So this is probably one of the things that we could do. So it's not going to be the same because honestly, protected areas are so expensive. So we don't expect all the countries to implement protected areas if there's not even funding coming from developed countries. So the answer to this is community-led conservation. And this is actually happening, for example, in Mali. Wild Foundation has this project called the Mali Elephant Project, and they are conserving, I think, like a large chunk of area, like acres of areas in Mali. So not only that they're empowering the communities there, but they're also conserving the species within the reserve. So that could be like one of the things that states or countries that can do or can move forward with or implement if it's not just protected areas. So that's up to them. That's going to be the discussion that we're going to have at COP15, that's for sure.
Thank you so much. So, thank you so much, Ian. Do you have any call for action to young people?
Honestly, I just really want to be vigilant. I'm really afraid that if we set not ambitious enough targets in the post 2020, we don't have time. We're already reaching the climate tipping points. We can't afford another failed IT targets. So we need to pressure our governments to make sure that they are implementing or they are committing ambitious targets at the COP15. Yeah, so that's just my 2 cents.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Ian. Very insightful. I never get tired of listening to Ian. But for this moment, I beg that we transition to the next set of speakers who are going to take us through the next session.